If you're not aware, this is the Incredible in the Black podcast, a podcast dedicated to covering the current events and social issues going on in your Black world and covering it all from the perspective of three grown-ass men who try to stay educated. I am your host, Big O, Mr. In the Black himself, but I can never, I guess I'm doing this alone tonight. All the light-skinned brothers are missing in action. But I have a very special guest tonight. Our guest tonight is Dr. Robert J. Patterson, professor of Black Studies at Georgetown University, where he served as the inaugural chair of the Department of African American Studies. He's the author of Exodus, Politics, and Destructive Desires, and the editor of the award-winning Black cultural production After Civil Rights. He's also co-chairs in the College Board Committee that developed the AP African American Studies course. His newest book is Black Narratives of Slavery, a very short introduction, out now from Oxford University Press. Dr. Patterson, thank you, man. I appreciate it. Welcome.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here, to be in brotherhood, to be in fellowship, and to be in good cheer.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Now, I know that I'm familiar with you. You're the big homie. You've been on the show before, so some people might know of you. But for those folks that don't know who you are, please. I know I gave you an intro and all, but you can speak better about yourself than I can. So please tell the folks about yourself.
Look, that's something that I don't necessarily, it's not that I like to do, but let me say, you've covered the ground. I'll just say a couple of things. I have always been passionate and interested in Black studies, Black people, Black life before I even knew that was necessarily an area of inquiry that I could study in college in some respects and graduate school, and then devote my life in many ways to that work. I like to, so that is by way of that. Sometimes I don't get into into some of the personal things, but why not? It's 2026, be newer. And so I do like to travel a lot. It actually is the opportunity to rethink, to reset, to get my mind clear, to make some waves on some of the projects I might be thinking about. I like to have a good time, and whether that's visiting Hillary.
Yeah. I know that some of you are not. I don't think many of you would be friends of Dr. Patterson on social media, but if you are, the pictures that he posts online make everybody jealous. So listen, I don't know. I can't tell you how many times the wife has asked me about some of the places that you've gone and why haven't we gone there yet? You've been getting me in trouble on the low. So I'm just trying to
look good. This is good. Good.
No. Don't do that. This is not good. I'm just trying to set me up. For those folks who don't know, I'm going to tell you, Dr. Patterson is passionate about his work. I think I met Dr. Patterson in 2013, 2014. So it's been a minute. And my introduction to Dr. Patterson was at a shindig, I guess, for lack of a better description. And Dr. Patterson was digging in some little boy's butt about Black history and how he doesn't agree. I was like, God damn, this is somebody.
Look,
the verbal whooping that you gave this young man has sat with me for how many daggone years, bro? I'm trying to tell you.
Listen, that's funny. And I think that it could be instructional. Here's the thing. When I go to social events, I just try to go as Robert. I just go as trying to hang out. And I actually discourage people from wanting to have, what they seem is casual banter or friendly talk about these topics, because I don't want it to lean or go towards the direction that you've identified, right? And so I say, just let us leave well enough alone. Let us enjoy some adult beverages. And as soon as they hear that, I've written a book or was in the process of writing a book or collaborating, or that I'm doing something related to the study of Black history, Black life, Black politics, Black culture, sometimes those conversations then want to, don't you agree with something I do not agree with? And then I have to clarify and now offer expertise, which is not to be confused with opinion.
Yes, indeed.
Right. Or as we used to write, as I used to learn this from my PhD mentor, this phrase that I have used in response to papers: you're passing supposition and stereotype off as facts. And so I don't like that. And so I suspect that is the circumstance that
Listen, okay, so I know that you have lamented on many of an occasion about the stress. Before we get into the book, lamented on many occasions the stresses that you experience by trying to straighten these young minds out. You've been doing this work for quite some time. Are you still feeling those stresses?
I will say that it's different. I think that I had a conversation maybe 2 weeks ago with one of my former students and former employees and former mentees, now turned friend. And I was saying how I have really watched the evolution of the students' engagement with some of these topics: Black studies, Black history, Black culture, Black life, just how it has just changed over time in ways that I do think speak to this current moment. And I think that some of this is about thinking about, you have an administration that is assaulting any and everything that's not white, in particular, that's Black. And I do wonder in some of these cases, are they wondering, if I leave in the next year or two with a degree in Black studies, what would that signify? So I do think that there may be some questions that that I could understand why they might be thinking about it. Although I would add, would you actually want to work at a place that had a problem with you having in Black studies or whatever the case might be, or taking these classes?
I dig it.
And I recognize that I am exacting in asking students to read, for example, to write, to think energetically, to participate in class, to come to class. I understand that that is not what some of the students are interested in. And I say in the beginning of the semester that these are what my interests are. And if you're not interested in these things, perhaps that
this might not be.
You might make a different choice. And each semester, someone still makes a choice, and then it sometimes becomes something. I have had wonderful, outstanding students who have had all types of academic and otherwise successes, and some who have been wonderful, and that has not been the case. And we've had wonderful, relationships and interaction. Having said all that, I do participate in conversations that are not about Robert Patterson, but that are about the current stage of academia, that are not about what happened in my class specifically or particularly, that may be a part of a larger conversation.
Dig it.
And, in some respects, the trends that we see across the board, students are not immune from them. And if that's sort of wanting to do something quickly, wanting AI to do some of the hard work, I was telling them there's nothing hard, there's nothing wrong with using AI, but you have to know enough to know if the AI messed it up.
Dig it.
You can't know if the AI messed it up if you don't know it to begin with.
If you don't know the root of it. I dig it 100%. Now, we already got started running our mouths with each other. So let me at least tell the good folks, if you're checking this out on YouTube, please make sure that you finesse that thumbs up button. It goes a long way. Hit the subscribe so that you can catch the next incredible episode. You can follow us across social media at In the Black PDCST, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of the places. Going over to our website, www.intheblackpdcst, you can subscribe to our newsletter so you can find out when the next Dr. Patterson's book is going to be coming out and all that other great stuff. And if you really want to become part of the family, you can join our Patreon. We promise you will not regret it. So let's get into the meat and potatoes, the real question about your book. Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Now, absolutely.
One of the first questions I have for you is about your research. Okay. Because I know this took you some time. You've been radio silent for a while, so I knew something. So in the book, one of the things in the book, you take apart one of the most famous moments in American history, Sojourner Truth's "Ain't I a Woman" speech. Now, the version everybody knows was written down by Frances Gage.
Yes,
a white abolitionist who gave Truth a Southern dialect.
Yes,
that she never had.
Yes.
Now, Truth grew up speaking Dutch in New York. But you don't throw that out though.
Right.
So what do we lose if we only trust the words enslaved people wrote for themselves? And what does Gage's version still tell us about how even white people who opposed slavery saw Black people?
Yeah, I thank you for that. I love that. I love that question. So we're jumping right in. So that's coming out of chapter 2. And so I want to answer that question, but I want to back it up just a little bit to say that part of the challenge of studying this moment in American history is the very fact that there are documents that were not retained, right, that were actually produced by Black people, but not necessarily preserved. There are places where the archive is actually oral. And so it needed to be transcribed. And so part of what I get at in that chapter is sort of thinking about the importance of looking at what I call oral narratives of slavery, right? That might have been later written down, but when they were first given out or when they were first produced, they were as speeches, they were as told to stories. They might have been sort of a family having conversation on its own and otherwise overheard.
The origin of the griot, for lack of a better description, African basis all through storytelling and so on. Yeah,
exactly right. And sort of thinking about those African retentions and those type of issues as well. And so part of what happens is that so absolutely right. So Frances Gage writes down this, ain't I a woman? And then some other scholars have sort of questioned whether it was actually aren't I a woman, getting at the point that there wasn't a dialect. And then there are some scholars who, because of the fact that it's not sort of verbatim what she said, and because of the dialect, they had dismissed Gage's transcription, fabrication, recollection, whatever word we like to use. But and so one of the
your use of fabrication is what I'm laughing at. But go ahead.
Right, that's right. And so because this is one of the interesting things is that this book is a very short introduction. So some of these details were in, and then they were out because all the books in this series are limited to 35,000 words. And so you really have to be precise and exacting in which you include. But some of this is lost. And so there's a scholar who then came back and said, well, I'm not sure we should actually throw this out, because as we begin to triangulate these sources, it seems that Truth did give this speech or version of it. And even if Gage embellished, fabricated, used some racial iconography to make it sound the way that it didn't, that it seems likely that Truth did have some version of this speech, and that it may not have been a question, it may have been a statement, I am a woman. And so the person sort of puts this forth too. That's and the scholar whose last name is Washington. And so basically I say all of that to say, even in the midst of these racist, I don't have a problem using that word, caricatures of that word either, of Black people, there are enough parallel sources in some respects and other information that can help us to disentangle or to get at what really might have been said. And what really might have been said may not actually be as important as the fact that you had Black people enslaved or otherwise, and in this case, formerly or whatever the case might have been,
indentured and so on, right?
Exactly, who were leading thought partners and activists in this work around Black humanity, around Black personhood, around Black creativity, around Black ingenuity, right? And so that is what that story is really trying to get at. And that comes in a chapter where, I'm also talking about the WPA narratives. And one of these are the, during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, this moment where the government hires people, oftentimes white, who would go to these communities of Black people who had been formerly enslaved to try to write down their stories of what it had been like to have been enslaved several decades later. And one of the most fascinating discoveries when you read a large swath of those narratives is that when there are white transcriptions of what these Black people told them, they look very much like that Frances Gage's transcription of Sojourner Truth, right? And years later, that is what it looks like, is these dialects or whatever the case might be. And then when you look at somewhere like Virginia, where the state of Virginia hired a not insignificant number of Black WPA workers who went out, you get a different presentation. So you get what someone might consider as non-dialect, or whether people like this language or not, standard English, for whatever that looks like. And you get more detailed narratives that really turn attention to the atrocities of enslavement. You get Black people thinking about the ongoing effects of slavery's legacies and Jim Crow, and talking in ways and revealing things to these Black recorders or workers that you don't necessarily see when they're talking to some of these white people who are recording workers. And we don't know if that's because they tell them and they exclude it, right? Or what I think reasonably is the case is that they don't tell them.
Okay, so I got to ask you this question then, because this dastardly fabrication that we've just talked about, has there ever, based on your understanding of how Black people's struggle here in America, or in the Americas, I should even say, has there ever been a time when we've been able to tell our own story without it ultimately being filtered through the white gaze or through white translation?
Yeah, I think so. I think that this is one of the most fascinating parts about reading these moments in history. I think these narratives in many ways are about what they say and as well as what they don't say. And part of what I talk about in the introduction by way of a scholar named Saidiya Hartman is this critical fabulation, which is really a way of thinking about how, contemporary, you can think of it as contemporary art producers or artists, or even contemporary people like me who are going and looking at these texts and trying to analyze them, are thinking about the ways that the imagination and the historical record, what's said and not said, comes together to produce a narrative about what actually happened or what could have happened. That's one way of thinking about it. But more to the point, we can take the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, or as we used to call him in graduate school, Freddie D, as if this were one of the homies, somebody we were hanging out with. And so you think about Frederick Douglass writes 3 autobiographical narratives over the course of the 19th century.
Okay.
So he writes the famed Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself in 1845. And that's the one I take up in chapter 1 when I'm talking about the written narratives of slavery.
Yeah.
And in that narrative, he says, he has no recollection of his family, he says, or limited recollection. And he makes it a point to follow the conventions of the narratives that were written around this time, where part of what you want to show is how disruptive, how horrible slavery had been to the familial unit. And so you drive home this narrative of disruption, and you make this the case. And we see this across narratives. I think I talked about Harriet Jacobs, who says she kind of had some recollection and then something happens. There is something that disrupts this, and that something is the evilness of white supremacy being facilitated through chattel slavery.
Yeah.
But then in My Bondage and Freedom, Douglass gives a little more about his family. And so we're thinking 1845, there's an autobiography that's really being used on the abolition circuit in conjunction with his collaboration with the different abolitionists who have a clear goal of trying to overthrow slavery. By the time we get into Reconstruction, so My Bondage and Freedom is circa the 1860s. By the time we get to 1875, 1877, the narrative life of times of Frederick Douglass, he has all this information in these narratives about slavery, about his family, not about slavery, about his family in these memories. Now, did he have amnesia? Did he have early onset, some kind of cognitive impairment? in the 1840s. I don't think that that's the case, right? So part of what Black people consistently historically have done is they have adjusted. We adjust to our audiences, to our circumstances, or whatever the case might be. So is this, is this pandering? Not sure. But is this strategic use of culture, of information, use of history, of politics, of political savviness to state claims out and then to kind of return to these narratives? And so that's one of the beauties that you see around someone who has such a long life, who has such a rounded out life. You see something like this and somebody like W.E. Du Bois, who talks about the talented 10th at the turn of the 20th century, who later says, I was misguided.
I was wrong. I might have had it wrong.
I had it wrong. So maybe this wasn't. And then for someone like our man Booker T, who people give a hard time to and who does things to make himself have a hard time, perhaps, because this is something I push back on.
Okay.
Not back on, but I offer some additional texture to in chapter 3, is that he dies, what we might say, is prematurely. And so Booker T doesn't really, he has all these writings and speeches, but he doesn't necessarily get a chance to revisit something he writes up from slavery, as Du Bois gets to revisit something he writes in The Souls of Black Folks. And so we don't know if Washington had the chance to return to this 30 years later, 40 years later, if there had been some different insights.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. So here's question number 2 for you. You argue that when the written record was built by the enslavers, imaginative work, novels, films, television, the whole nine, it becomes its own archive.
Yes.
Now that's a big claim.
Yes.
How do you answer somebody who says a novel isn't evidence?
Oh, poor things.
That Colson Whitehead or Octavia Butler is at the end of the day making it up. So how do you answer that question?
Yeah, I would say to that, I would encourage that person to think more energetically about the processes that actually go into the work that novelists do, right? And so when one listens to artists talk about the craft, talk about the research, right, that goes into particularly these genres that are around recuperating historical periods that are about thinking about what's been left out of an archive, then part of what they're saying is that we've actually done some research. We've gone and we've looked at primary documents. We've gone and we've looked at newspapers. We've looked at records of bodies that were exchanged. We've looked at diaries. We've looked at these items, these artifacts, to tell us what they have said and to think about or perhaps imagine kind of what they haven't said. And so there is this marriage of sorts of the imagination and this other thing. But I want to make an important point about this for 2 other reasons that I would be, as I like to say, remiss. That's a good Black word. I would be remiss, and I don't like being remiss for anybody who knows me or who doesn't know me. So the first point about that is that part of that claim, it yields too much room to a set of documents that we know are problematic, that we know don't tell the story, that we know intentionally excluded Black voices in the writing of these narratives. There are textbooks that have said chattel slavery. They wouldn't use the term slavery. That would say they were workers.
Yeah, or that made it seem like there was a partnership between.
There was a partnership. There was a collaboration.
Yeah.
Right now, in Philadelphia, I believe it was a museum in Philadelphia, but at these Smithsonian's, there is a concerted effort to rewrite these histories about slavery, about what white people's roles were in perpetuating the institution.
Yeah.
And without any pushback or retaining of these facts, those will become the narratives, and people will be running around saying, this is what it was.
Yeah, when
right?
it wasn't that.
So,
Yeah.
and it wasn't that. So that's one thing. The second thing is just as important. Art and culture have consistently been important ways and important areas in which Black people have done and shaped politics. And so we go back to this example of Frederick Douglass and the narrative of the life, Harriet Jacobs, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, the abolition movement might have taken those up and moved with them and given them a piece of life, right? And they also were actively involved in making sure that the abolitionist movement was able to take these issues up and give them life, because the big goal was to do what? To overthrow the institution of slavery. So the big point here is that historical narratives themselves are not about this thing happened, this thing happened, this thing happened, facts, as people like to use that term. There is a level of interpretation, even if it is to decide what is to be included and what's not to be included, what's to be excluded or not included.
Yeah.
And that is part of what's at stake in these conversations and in these debates, to diminish not only Black experience and Black contributions. That in of itself is problematic. But what these people are really trying to do in this moment is to deny anti-Black racism and white supremacy, to deny its effects, and then to pretend like those things never happened and do not exist, and that things are the way they are by happenstance of what Black people have done or haven't done.
Yeah,
right? If you would just work harder, if you would just do these things, you could be where we are.
Yeah.
And that is a failure of honesty, integrity, but also the facts of history don't bear out to that.
But I think that's one of the biggest challenges. I hate to beat a dead horse, but it's one of the reasons why I have, probably not just me, why many people have difficulty accepting, reading, and digesting Black history. Not because there's no truth to it, but because ultimately the feeling is, for those of us that are more cognitively aware,
right,
that ultimately that narrative, that story, that fact, if you want to put that term on it, ultimately gets filtered through the white gaze or through a white filter.
right.
So it's like, how much of what I'm getting can I necessarily trust, because I know it had to go through this filter first before it gets to me.
Yes, I think that's excellent. And I'm glad you said that, because this is what this Black Narratives of Slavery, a very short introduction, this is really what it is trying to do. It's trying to offer that one approach to engaging that is to really getting into Black produced texts that are consciously doing the thing you just said, which is either resisting this gaze or attempting to have a more fleshed out, a more nuanced perspective, right? And so we think about someone like, I'll go back to Harriet Jacobs, and I'm going to pivot to cinema in 1 second, which is what chapter 5 takes up, these cinematic or these visual narratives of slavery.
Got it.
And so, Harriet Jacobs is sexually harassed by her owner, Dr. Flint. And Harriet Jacobs talks about this man slipping her notes because he knew she knew how to read, even though, Black people supposedly couldn't.
Right.
They have the capacity to. And, hounding her and wants her to sleep not in the cabin, but then next to the wife. And then the wife is doing absurd things like whispering in her ear, pretending like it's the husband to see how she responds. I mean, this is just ludicrous, right? Although this could make an interesting Black film in some respects. But in any case, she never says that he sexually violates her, that he rapes her, right? She says that she ends up having sex with this man, and she says she thought it would be less degrading to give herself to someone than to be violated, which makes a lot of sense. And it shows, again, in that moment, yes, there's this harassment, but she's actually
negotiation of trying to preserve herself.
That's exactly right. So we think about resistance. We think about how those things look, that these things don't have to be, slitting his throat from one neck to the other, although people perhaps would have preferred that. The point, though, is that, and so she makes this choice. And so even in these limited situations, we're making choices. And that should resonate in all kind of contexts for many people, perhaps, but I'd like talking about to and about Black people, right? And so this makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the questions becomes, why wouldn't he have raped her? He has the law. He has all these things on his side to kind of make this be the case. There have been people who have done wonderful archival work on this, trying to kind of figure out if that did happen, if she didn't say it, whatever the case might be. But I think that the point we're trying to make here is that whether she tells us this or not becomes kind of secondary to her point, which is that the circumstances of slavery, the law, the complicitness of white women who are wives with white patriarchy, all that makes Black women unsafe. And so whether they were raped or the threat of rape, both are endangering, right? And that becomes central to what the question is. And I think that one of the most important, one of the most fascinating points about this is one of my colleagues, Caretha Mitchell, who is a professor of English at Boston College. She's written about how, in some respects, Harriet Jacobs becomes like a foremother to some of the women in the Me Too movement, right? And sort of thinking about this and thinking about later what becomes kind of Black feminist thought. And so part of what I say here is that these early foreparents, foremothers, ancestors, whatever you want to say, part of what going back to what they did, going back to their work, going back to their thinking, going back to their epistemology, if you want to use that term, is that it does create this genealogy. It does create this lineage that is decidedly putting to the forefront of the conversation Black people, what they were doing it and how they were doing it, not only necessarily in response to anti-Black racism and white supremacy, which are always overarching, but even in those absences, how are they creating culture? How are they formulating community? What does this look like? What does this actually mean?
So I know you said you wanted to pivot to cinema, and I want to help you make that pivot.
Thank you.
I have to return to how all of our narratives get filtered through the white gaze. We look shortly after Reconstruction, one of quote unquote Time magazine and the New York Times and many other outlets had Birth of a Nation as one of the greatest films of all times. And that was the I guess the introduction, if you want to say it, to cinematic anti-Black stereotypes and racism in the United States, or in the Americas. So once again, we still see some of those little tidbits here and there in cinema, and it's gotten better not to overstretch it, but at the same time, those elements still exist. So how do we make that separation, especially in media, especially at a time when we're always consuming? Netflix is on your phone, all of those things. How are we able to stretch or remove ourselves and not fall into the trap of, once again, the white gaze or the white filter?
Yeah, absolutely. I would like to just put a point on the birth of a nation, because I think there were two conversations happening about that film at the time, and I think that that's actually the case now too. And what I mean by that is, Woodrow Wilson is purportedly to have had people over to the White House to view it, and just, as reporters have said, this is history where there's lightning and all the things. And I think that part of turning that gaze on itself is to say, yeah, this is something, but it's not what y'all think it is. And this is part of what I get at in chapter 5 that talks about these cinematic or visual narratives of slavery, in particular Nate Parker's 2016 film by the same name, right? Yeah. And so what I think that film does is it actually underwrites the the pervasiveness, the widespread ways that white supremacy, that white depravity, that anti-Black racism, that white violence is critical to the sustainment of a nation that was built on the destruction of Black people and Black bodies. And that is the story. That actually is the story that The Birth of a Nation tells and that we should remember, right? That is the story that it tells. That needs to be remembered. This notion that Gus, is chasing this white woman, and she'd rather tumble and throw herself
off a cliff than to be touched by a Black man.
To be touched by a Black man, as our sister Ida B. Wells, anti-lynching activist, has written about, these cries of rape, or these notions of the Black man as the perpetual rapist, this is more mythology than actual practice. And that oftentimes when this happens, these are consensual relationships that once they become known, right? So we know this.
They need to find it out.
They got to find it out.
They say that every accusation is a confession. So
right. In terms of doing this. And so it's all of this silliness, but it has material impacts. People saw that, and you saw lynchings increase, right?
Yeah.
So you see all this violence, whatever cases. So it is real. It has real material consequences. And I do think that back to the point earlier about if something's just fiction or if it's not, whatever. Well, these cinematic representations had material consequences of on Black people. And so we could use that as an example to think about the other question as well.
Got it.
I think that part of what we're seeing is the fact that even if a white gaze exists, it is not the gaze, it is not the audience that the cultural production is being targeted to. And so I think that kind of, because we could concede, I could say there's going to always be a white gaze.
Yeah.
And these stereotypes, whether it is hypersexual or oversexual or undersexualized, whatever the case is, if Black people are constantly being stereotyped, then there is no space, or there's very limited space to move anything. Because if we concede that being the case, then it would seem as though we're always responding to or not trying to be this, that, or the other thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if we accept the fact that anti-Black racism essentially wants to deny the humanity of Black people in terms of representation, whether it's in written, visual, or otherwise, once we know that's the case, when we are doing these depictions that are pertaining to Black humanity, if we want to think about that, Black people or their desires, whatever the case is, what these Black representations are trying to do, it seems, is to show what those dimensions of humanity look like, but it's never a question about proving that the humanity exists. We take that as our starting point, right? We are human beings who have conflicting desires, who may feed into what somebody might call one of these stereotypes, but that's not what the guiding principle is. That I enjoy this thing, and this might be, kind of what that stereotype is. And so in my discussion of Nate Parker's The Birth of a Nation, I take up some of these issues. I take up the original. I take up some of the stereotypes that we might have just talked about. The Black man as eternal rapist, the brute, whatever. I take up what Nate Parker says that he was trying to do in the film. And then I take up sort of this fact that you said, which is that, I know I have Black friends who have basically said, I don't want to see a movie about slavery. I don't want to see another movie about, about this horror, about this trauma. Yeah. And this is really what I write. I say, who wants to see another Black body thrown overboard into the Atlantic Ocean, right? Who wants to see the scarring of one's back, right? The anniversary of Kunta Kinte coming up. Who wants to see some limb being chopped off, right? Who really wants to see that, or whatever the case is? And does that type of representation on the screen, does it function to paralyze people? Does it make them not want to see it? Does it make them not, do they not make these connections between what was done in slavery and what being a temporary was being done in a contemporary moment, because they are actually immobilized by the level of violence that they see in these films, right? So I take that up. I think those are real. I think those are honest. I think those are hard questions. And I think that this is something that people who make these films, I do think that these are important things that they grapple with, right? But what I will say I've been avoiding these buts because two things we know are true at once.
Can encompass the same space at the same time,
right? At the same damn time as the as one of the hip hop artists might say. So, because that is in fact true, I do think that there are other stories that are actually being told in those spaces that we can kind of miss out on. And so one of those scenes that I take up is in The Birth of a Nation. There is the scene where Nate and his dad, they have gone out and they have some encounter with some patrollers, and the dad defends himself and kills one of the people who's trying to basically harass them. Nate takes off. They get back to the cabin. They run. Anyway, the point is, the people show up to find out where Nate's dad is. I'm conflating this. I'm doing something that I hate doing. It is not. It's not. I'm confused. I'm conflating Nate and Nat, but they pull up to find out where Nat's dad is, and at some point, some of the items that they had brought back almost roll out in front of the patrollers. And so the mother, gets on the ground, like, "Oh no, master, please don't," whatever the case is.
Yeah.
And what she's doing is she is protecting everybody, because by doing that, she is covering up the items that had begun to roll that would have put them in a precarious situation, right? So it becomes this somewhat, ironically, perhaps comical moment that draws attention to, do you know the things that Black people had to do? Did you know the level of being engaged? Do you know the level of quick thinking?
The ingenuity that came behind
ingenuity that Black people had to do to stay alive during chattel slavery? Right? Yeah. And that is one of those interesting takeaways. That's just one of those interesting takeaways, right? And so there's that. When the Black men are preparing for battle and they are standing around and they know they're all not going to make it.
Yeah.
Right. So there is a decision that has been made that I am going to get as far as I can because I see something else. And the alternative to remaining enslaved with these immoral people who purport to be Christians is that I'm willing to take this risk. And so they're sitting around, the sun is rising, Nat's leading the conversation, and they're reflecting on, had they still been on the plantation, this is what we would have been doing at 5 a.m. Right? And there's again the kind of way he said, I would pour this water over Master's head, right? And you think about all the moments people would have wanted to have done that, right? But they resisted in other ways, whether it was slowing down work, right? That's a way of reclaiming your economic value, whether it was pretending to be sick, right? It may have been. And so I think that part of what these stories do is they really just show, one of the things they do is they show how one of the central logics to dehumanize Black people during enslavement and prior to it was that because they were not human, we lacked the capacity to think, to reason, to do all of the things that are fundamentally
human,
central to the human experience. And there is nothing about these representations that could lead us to that conclusion. And we also know that when Black people were together in the absence of these whites, owners, and otherwise supremacists and cruel people, they were doing what we do now when third parties, whomever they may be, are not
present. I
they
dig
were
it.
talking, they were shucking, they were laughing, they were having a good time, they were saying stuff about them, they were demonstrating these things. And that is part of what that thing I said before, critical fabulation, that's part of what it gets at. That's part of what Colson Whitehead, who you use as an example, Toni Morrison, any of these people, that's part of what they're getting at when they bring some historical points together and then they fill in the humanity that was otherwise left out or purposefully excluded.
I dig it. All right. So I'm going to read a question that we posed to our Patreon subscribers. If you're not a subscriber, I don't know what you're doing. You should become a subscriber. Come on over and join the family. And this is one of the questions that we got back. There's a line in your epilogue that I want to say out loud. You write that 400 is greater than 60.
Come on.
400 years of legalized discrimination against 60 years since civil rights legislation. And that expecting 60 to undo 400 is implausible. When someone tells you slavery was a long time ago and it's time to move on, is that the argument you make? And in your experience, does it land?
That is part of the argument that I make, right? And so part of what I say in that context or in that passage is that, again, this is like a math lesson, right? And so I think that it's important to start there because when people do come with the question or the point that people just made, it's sort of like, of course we're beyond this, right? So I want to turn that back on how, in quantifiable terms, how can we be beyond that? How could we actually be? How could 65, depending on what you think of as your markers, some people might say 70 if you want to use Brown as sort of the beginning.
I dig it.
Right?
Okay.
If you want to use Brown again, how would 70 years undo? How could 70 years of haphazard, well-intentioned in some cases, but incomplete public policy.
That's being kind about.
That's being very generous. That is enforced. That is consistently being eroded. Was being eroded as early as the 1970s, right? And so we know that the first challenge to affirmative action is with the Bois case, right? And I believe it was in 77. So we know that there was always these attempts to undo it. We know that we get the war on poverty with Johnson that sort of builds on the work of the civil rights legislation. And then no sooner than that happens, Nixon comes in and has a war on the impoverished.
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
which was intentionally towards black people.
Yes.
Right. That gets extended and Reagan, these people ultimately come out and admit this in all kind of ways.
Yeah.
So the point is that you can't have a intentional, systemic, right, systematized institution that worked diligently to suppress Black people's abilities to have access, to succeed, to have economic, cultural, political, any of these forms of power, to then think that these piecemeal, they might have been thought out, but as far as implementation goes, how they will be implemented, to be implemented across time, to undo those effects, it just hasn't happened. And it's unreasonable to think that it would be the case because you would need years to close the gap.
And then an additional 100 and some odd years to get advanced.
And then just to get on parity, right? Just for parity. And I think that this is part of the question not part of the question. This is where the movement comes from, equity to equality, or equality to equity, rather. Right? Part of why you kind of see this equity language. And I've taught a course on race and racism in American culture. And one of the books we do is by this white woman scholar named Paula Rothenberg. And it's called something about race in the United States or something like that in one of the editions. But the point is, it says, to have educate, and this was last published, the edition I used maybe 15 years ago. So this is worse now. It might say it'll take 150 years from then, 2150, to be able to have some educational parity. Other things were 200 years, right? And so the students will be sad because it's not going to happen in your lifetime, mine either, or whatever the case might be. And so I say that to say, yes, that is part of the math lesson. I think is a good way to kind of start that conversation because it just doesn't make sense. This is 400, and then those other pieces, if you know them or familiar with it, they add to that conversation. Those systems, slavery and Jim Crow, they were well designed.
Yeah.
They were better designed than affirmative action policies.
Yeah, by far. By far. And I think you can't say that Jim Crow and the post Reconstruction era, there's a part of like the affirmative action period that I think many people would argue there was a level of there wasn't any genuineness in it, for lack of a better description. Right. It was a political machine to get votes or to help usher in a Democratic Party. Right. Not necessarily that they were genuine about the ultimate or the end effects that it would ultimately take. So, all right, I want to get you out on this last question, and it's about the moment that we're in currently. And how you've written a short and accessible introduction to this history at a moment when books are being banned, critical race theories under attack, and there's been federal rollback of a bunch of different things, diversity programs and so on. Now, you write in the epilogue that institutions capitulating makes this work more urgent. Was this book a response to that? And what do you say to a young person being taught that this history is divisive?
Right. I would say a couple of things, if I might. So this, as I, like a good Black preacher, before I take my seat, I'm gonna have to I fully exegete the text in the AME tradition, and homage to Richard Allen and Jarena Lee. But a couple things. So yes and no. This machination of the moment. So the book was published in 26, but I had been working on it prior to that. I got slowed down. There was, life be life, and as we like. I mean,
it's hard to jet set and be writing at the same time, bro.
Listen, sometimes when I'm over and wherever, it's a good time. I get a good thought. I get some good clarity on this supremacy stuff. But I will say that when they approached me about writing, as I said, this is a part of this very short introduction series to be introductory. They had a different vision in mind. And part of the vision in mind was that this really would have been about the autobiographical narratives that formerly enslaved people had written. And so it might have been a survey of those narratives. And I said, I think that this is fascinating, but that's not the book for me to write. The book for me to write is to make the connections from slavery to the contemporary moment, right? Because the legacies of Jim Crow, the legacies of slavery are still manifesting themselves. They manifest themselves at the base level in denial that there is no legacy, that it doesn't exist, right? So to me, to get to part of that question, that is exactly part of what the point is. Books like this one are trying to make sure that we not only get the different historical records right that are reflecting the contributions that Black people have been making and continue to make, but that we thread the needle from slavery to the present, and how some of the things that we're seeing, right? Voter suppression, we're back in slavery, right? Lack of access to healthcare, we're back in slavery. I mean, part of what I say is that there is not a contemporary issue that is plaguing, adversely impacting, negatively impacting Black people and Black communities that is not implicitly, and I would also say in many ways explicitly, though people will try to deny this, related to slavery or Jim Crow. And so I think that's that. What's divisive is white supremacy trying to suppress Black people and Black culture. That is what is divisive. Telling the stories, the multiple stories about Black life, about Black politics, about Black cultural contributions, that is telling the American story that oftentimes is not told in ways that it should be.
Yeah.
It is for that reason that I participated in that is among the reasons that I participated in the construction of this course for AP African American Studies, to be able to expose hundreds of thousands of students to Black history and culture that they can then go and study further in college or on their own. Otherwise, I think is doing a great service to kind of what needs to be done. This moment of what these people are trying to do in terms of banning books, right? I say this when I speak to younger people, because sometimes reading, there might be other things one might want to do other than read. That to older people too, to myself, sometimes, oh Lord, why did I pick this hobby? Right?
You had to pick up this book of all books to pick up.
Why did I like doing this? And so, what I will say though, would somebody be working in somebody or institution if this stuff didn't matter? If this information was just wrong and this information were so inaccurate, there's all kind of inaccurate stuff that's floating out in the atmosphere, right? No one's trying to ban, bad climate science, right? No one's trying to do this. They might say it's bad or it's not true, but they're not trying to ban it.
I dig it.
So why is it that someone would be working so hard to try to get you to not read something if it were just fake or not important? People who claim they don't want to regulate. These are people who claim that you should be able to do whatever.
Speech. Say and do whatever.
Except for when I don't like what you're saying, because it indicts, because it calls attention to the things that I do are deeply invested in. So if voting weren't important, if you have no say, for people who have sort of young people sometimes who adopt that voting isn't effective. Yeah,
they checked out. Yeah.
The best way to suppress voting is to have you to believe that your vote does not matter, because then you will not vote, and I won't need a law to make it more difficult. I won't need to close a polling place early. I won't need to do anything. Right? And so I'd say to stay woke, right? They tried to co-opt all these terms.
You gotta be careful using some of these terms, right? Man.
Some of these times we'll be up on one of these lists, but that's fine, because this is just kind of true. And so what I say is that, and it could seem cliche, whatever the case might be, but there's a reason why people used to say knowledge is power, and it is not just cliche. It's actually because when you have access to this information and you go into more depth than that's sometimes allowed or permitted or that's presented on the surface, then it is hard to be argued with, or even if people try to argue with it, then it's sign is like, look, you have to pull up the kind of receipts. Yeah, and so yes, the Civil Rights Acts were important, and the Civil Rights Acts did increase access, and they did increase outcomes.
Yeah. And right, I know I said I was going to get you out on that last question, but I got to ask you a follow up. And
go ahead.
We can go ahead and we can wrap it up immediately after that. There are people who want the power. Reading is power. Knowledge is power. But in this day and age of misinformation and disinformation, it's become more and more difficult to parse what's truth and what's not.
That's true.
So as an academic, as a professor, as someone who's learned, as someone who's been doing the research, how do you, or what advice would you give to someone who is trying to take this information in and parse it so that they know what's real and what's not?
Right. So I think that in order to do that and to do that effectively, one has to be persistent and curious. And I say that because it means you got to read multiple sources, right? And I think that it becomes a big point. Also, I think there are places to go that sort of, I wouldn't say pre-vet these things, but there are, for example, accessibility, maybe not so, but there's certain university presses, there will have been a review process that will lend itself to the fact that, there might be some disagreement and argument, but these are at least vet it and have some points there. But Michael Harriet has a book called Black History AF. And AF stands for what y'all know it stands for. But the point here is that it really pushes to some of the things you might know, and then there's something you just really didn't maybe know about it, right? Or the other thing that people will do is they'll do something reductionist. So they'll say, well, this Black person did this, but then they did this thing that may not have been supporting Black history to its finest.
Right, to try and throw the whole work that they did.
And they try to throw it out. Yeah. And say that. And I know I got to go, but let me just say this before we take up the offering. This is about Booker T. Washington. And I make this point in chapter 3. So people oftentimes stop Booker T in the debate with W.E.B. Du Bois. Okay. But even if you accept what W.E.B. Du Bois about the talented 10th, you might ask, well, what was he going to do with the other 90% of the population? Probably they would have been doing the industrial education that Booker T. Washington had been promoting, right? Yeah. And so part of it was that. And although people may have wanted Booker T. Washington to be in people's faces saying, hey, you want us to be at the bottom of the totem pole, you want us to carry these buckets, you want us to be in the back of the bus, you want us to be second-class citizens. Part of what he does in that money that he raises at Tuskegee is create a generation, a class of educated Black entrepreneurs who may not have had access to other things, but for what they were able to do in that institution. And lastly, Booker T. Washington put up a not insignificant amount of money to join lawsuits that were challenging all of those restrictive laws throughout the South that were infringing upon the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. People are complicated. People are, contradictory, and they do multiple things. Yeah. And you don't know that if you stop at the 1903 debate, if you only read Du Bois's text, and if you don't sort of do further investigation and push into these archives that people sometimes think are otherwise have been exhausted.
Dr. Robert Patterson, I really appreciate you taking the time out. The plate's going around, so people are taking the offering up now. So I know what time it is. Please, man, before we get out of here, please tell the folks where they can find you if they'd like to find you, any other new projects that you have coming up, and possibly where the best vacation spots are, because I know you got the good information on that too.
So where you can find me, I am attempting to get better with the social media. The fact that I'm putting a "the" in front of it should tell you how good I am with it.
You just aged yourself too and all that.
Well, I just blackened myself actually, because if I had said social media, it would have been double black, because we between the S and the "the," that gets us right. But I'm gonna do better. I say it and I don't. However, DRRJ Patterson on Twitter, so you can find me there.
Okay.
You can find me on. It might be more complicated, but you can find me on Facebook too. Now it might take some maneuvering because of what the settings are, but one can, and people seem to, and so you can find me there. So those are the main places.
Dig it.
As far as next projects go, so I have been moved to do another passion project. So my book on rhythm and blues culture. Part of what I loved, and part of why I was able to do it while I was doing all this heavy administrative work at Georgetown, is because I just love what I was writing about. I was writing about film, and I was writing about artists, and I had the chance to fly to Phoenix and interview Adina Howard, and it was just delightful in all these kind of ways. And I have consistently had an affection for the 1990s, and so the project that I'm currently working on and thinking about, I had done another pivot. I said, I want to write about something that'll be fun.
Okay.
I want to write about the 1990s, but not the 90s itself. We are living in a profound moment in the 21st century where the 1990s is consistently being summoned, right? Even next month, the reboot of, or the 21st century version of A Different World is going to hit.
Yeah.
We had The Best Man, and then we had The Best Man Holiday, and then we had The Best Man, the final chapters, right? We had Boomerang, and then we had the young folks of Boomerang. And so we see this, we see the songs. We see Burna Boy going back to Tony Braxton's "He Wasn't
Yeah,
Man," right? So we
yeah.
constantly see these invocations of the 1990s. So the book that I'm working on now, this project that I believe is going to become it, is called "For the Culture: Black Life in the 1990s." So
Wonderful. Can't wait. I can't wait for you to bring that out.
Another thing that I have all this stuff on it is reparations and Black communities. And so I'm thinking about working on that. There are days where I'm just sort of like, I think this is important, is every day. What I had to think about was my audience. And so this is not to persuade white people about the importance of reparations and why it matters. It is to equip Black and other people who are interested in sort of the history and the language and the culture to be able to stake those claims.
So they have the receipts necessary when they have to argue in this conversation.
That's exactly right. The best vacation spots. This is a hard one. I can't deal with the superlative. But what I can tell y'all, now you're getting this hot off the press because I have not made a post about this yet. But Japan is delightful. I've had the opportunity in April to go to Tokyo, Kyoto, I believe.
Did you go to Shinjuku or have an opportunity to go to Shinjuku?
I went past it, but Tokyo's so big, right?
Yeah, like fair enough.
We moved into the park, and it was really the first time I had to really rely on public transportation. And so that, and then I finished in Hiroshima, which just was delightful and heartbreaking in terms of the
history and all of that.
And the museum and the artifacts they had kept, for there. But it was just delightful in terms of the options, the customer service, all of the things, the culture. You just get such a variety. I don't know if y'all know this, but you may know about Japanese whiskey, but I'm just stopped by to tell you that Japanese gin is where it's at, and the distilleries were hitting. And so if if you partake in what one might call the devil's cup, then there's that. And so I did all kind of things, and Google Translate will help you. And they are very excited to see Americans. Well, I don't know about Americans, but this Black American, they were excited to see.
They like chocolate faces over there.
Right,
in Japan,
exactly. It's about the only place they don't. So I'm going to give it out to Japan for 2026. I also did go to Ghana in March, and that was delightful. And
we're going to need to talk offline about your trip to Ghana because I mean, there's the whole year of return in 2019 and how things have transpired since then. That's a whole.
This was so when we went down. See, this is why you can't. We've been closing for 10 minutes. But when you, just why I said it's a Black church.
Yeah, I know, right? I know.
I'll just say this. What you just identified. When we went down to the point of last return, this was a conversation and this was a thing about the commercialization, would be a perhaps polite way to put it, about the exploitation, what that means and what that looks like. And so we were cognizant, and when you look at the demographics of who was down there, who was leading these initiatives or these explorations, that definitely came up.
Okay, so forget the closing. We know we're going to close. This is for the Patreon folks. They're going to get a little bit extra. We got to have this conversation. So when we went to Ghana in 2019, and that was during the year of return,
right?
And it was my first time going to another African country.
Okay,
I'm originally from Nigeria, so going to Ghana was an eye-opening experience, just to compare it to Nigerian culture and so on and all of that stuff. And we did go to the slave castles.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say that going to the slave castles, when somebody tells you that they did something and they had a spiritual feeling, I stepped in there, and I'm not going to lie to you, like I felt it on my skin. I couldn't shake it off.
Right.
And I didn't understand one of the things that I will say. I did ultimately, as much as I was impassioned and overwhelmed by the whole experience, I did ask myself afterwards when we were ending the tour, what benefit is this?
Right.
Because when we finished, a lot of the faces that we saw were white faces.
Right.
taking pictures by the cannons and by the beach side and all that other stuff at the slave castle.
Right.
So I'm thinking to myself, is it fair? Is it moral to monetize the pain of enslavement? And then once again, ultimately, we've been talking about throughout the entire show, having it go through the white gaze before it gets to the general public.
Right. So to the degree, it was such a rich experience, right? So at Elmina Castle in particular, the rage that when we were touring and we get to the point of the governor's bedroom.
Yeah.
And when they said that man had a little shoot to have the enslaved woman run up to him, or whatever the case is, whatever I had been feeling prior to that, I was disgusted on a number of levels, right?
Yeah.
And then to have that be on top of a church, so I had that experience. But let me tell you what changed that thing for me. I'm just going to answer this question, because as I was having that experience, I looked out and I saw all these beautiful black children just playing around the sand, and around the sea. And I thought, a place where they would have been being made further captive or taken to a premature death has been repurposed in some respects, right? And so I use that to simply say that once I take as being the fact that this white gaze is always going to be present and doing what it may do, which may not be helpful, then what are sort of the other things that I can kind of pull and kind of extrapolate from that too, right? And so we had a fascinating discussion about why they were playing around it, but why they don't swim in there, right? As reverence for the ancestors who have made that as their final resting place, right? And kind of learn that in whatever the case might be. Small fees to get into this place or whatever the case is. I think that the problem you've identified is the same problem with people viewing some of these films on slavery that are trying to make connections.
Yeah.
Is that they don't go and see, I'm situated in this. And as much as I could have been enslaved because I was black, you could have been an enslaved or benefited by virtue of your not being black and being white. And there's that identification not being made. But having said all that, I don't think that overshadows, and I think this is my overarching point, of the benefits of being in that place of sort of transcending time, of sort of, as you said, something spiritual, making those connections, coming back with a different sense of the self, of a different sense of your relationship, or one's relationship to the black diaspora or the African diaspora, or things of the sort of understanding why they don't swim, why you don't see them in these places, and having that, because you then can map that history onto it. And so I think that becomes more of a priority. And I think if we wait on some people to be moral and come to realizations, then we may as well go ahead and take our rest now.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. All right, I think we're going to wrap it up now. I am Big O. Dr. Patterson's already told you where you can find him, all the projects he's working on and all that great stuff. Once again, Dr. Patterson, man, I really appreciate you taking time out. I know you've got a busy schedule, so thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to actually chop it up with me, and I really appreciate it, man.
Thank you for the opportunity.
No problem, man. If you are following us, you need to follow us across. If you're not following us, I should say, you should be following us across social media at In the Black PDCST. I am your host, Big O, Mr. In the Black himself. You can find me on Twitter and on Instagram at MR_In the Black. And I want to thank you guys for joining us for another incredible episode of the In the Black podcast. You could have been anywhere else in the world, but you chose to kick it with us, and we really appreciate you for it. Make sure you follow us across social media. As I said, go ahead and come on over to our website and become a subscriber to our newsletter. And if you really want to become part of the family, of course, come and join our Patreon. We promise you will not regret it. But until next time, as always, informed, intelligent, in the Black. Peace.